Hello and welcome to this session on reimagining pharmaceutical innovation. My name's Helen. I'm from the University of York, and I'm really happy that you can join us at this session today. I just want to tell you about our great four speakers. So I'll talk about them in speaker order. Firstly, we'll have Brian D. Smith speaking to us. He's a visiting professor at the University College London, University Bocconi University, and the University of Hertfordshire. We also have Huseyin Naci, who's an associate professor in the Department of Health Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. James Lomas, who is a health economist and is the director of the Health Economics by Distance Learning Programme MSc at the University of York, and Victoria Charlton, who's a researcher at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. I would like now to turn to our speakers, please. So I wanted to start with Brian D. Smith. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to start with the observation that discussion about pharmaceutical innovation is often polarised. It's polarised between the industry and its critics in particular. So let me start by saying something that everybody, I think, on both sides of those arguments can agree on. We all want new innovative medicines. We all want them to meet society's most important needs, and we all want them to be affordable and accessible to everyone. And we want the industry that provides these new, valuable, affordable medicines to be economically viable in the long term, so that the benefits of pharmaceutical innovation are available to our children and to their children. Oh, and we also want all of the good jobs and the tax revenue that comes with a thriving industry and the international competitiveness. So I don't think I've said anything contentious there. It's statements of the obvious, I think. I think we all agree on the end, it's just the means that people tend to argue about. And this is a long-standing debate. In the course of the research for my last book, which was called New Drugs, Fair Prices, I found that today's arguments about price controls, profiteering companies, and incentives innovation were very old, and they were tired when my grandfather was a young man. So how can we look at this problem through new eyes? How, in other words, can we reimagine pharmaceutical innovation? Well, I think we must begin by recognising that pharmaceutical innovation is not a machine. Although we tend to talk about it as a pipeline, you can't control what comes out of it simply by what you put in. No, it's more accurate to say that pharmaceutical innovation is an ecosystem, like a rainforest or an orchard, or perhaps most appropriately, it's like the old physical gardens that apothecaries grew at the back of their houses to get the medicines that they sold. And this is highly important, highly relevant, because ecosystems are not machines. They are complex adaptive systems, just like the stock market is or like the climate is. And what we see come out of complex adaptive systems, like a share price or a thunderstorm, is an emergent property of that complex adaptive system. The pharmaceutical innovation ecosystem is a complex adaptive ecosystem that includes not only biotechs and pharma companies, but also regulators and patent officers and academic researchers and healthcare systems and insurers and the NIH and many other entities. And the new medicines that we get, their indications, their efficacy, their accessibility, are emergent properties of that complex adaptive system. This view of pharmaceutical innovation has two profound implications. Firstly, it means that any single simple intervention will probably not have the outcome we want and will almost certainly have unintended consequences. We saw that when we invented and used DDT on apples, and we saw it when we started buying antibiotics on price alone. Secondly, to get the outcomes that we want, we need to manage the ecosystem holistically, thinking about how everything interacts with everything else, and not just one outcome like price, but overall outcome of economically sustainable and accessible innovation of the medicines that we need. So if we view the pharmaceutical innovation ecosystem as a garden to be managed holistically, what might that involve? Well, having just written an 80,000 word book on this subject, it's difficult for me to summarize in a few sentences, but let me try to identify the three things that are at the top of the gardener's to-do list. First, we must reduce the translational risk associated with pharmaceutical innovation by investing much more money in the translational science that underpins it. The NIH has an agenda for this. We know what to research. but mostly we spend the money on trying to take more shots at goal instead of trying to improve our success rate. Secondly, we need to assess the value of innovation in an ecologically valid manner, a real-world valid manner, by improving HTA methodologies and the real-world evidence system that it depends on. There's a lot of good work going on in this area, but for the most part, the value of new medicines is still assessed using tools that are not fully developed and using data that was meant for clinical, not economic assessment. Third, we have to fix the imbalances of market power in the pharmaceutical market so that the value of new medicines, the value that new medicines creates, is fairly distributed between the innovators, the payers, the patients, and others. To do this would include reform of patent and exclusivity systems. It would include limiting the power of intermediaries like PBMs in the US, and balancing market power between innovators and payers. Now, I am, of course, fully aware of the difficulty of doing these three things. The devil is always in the detail. And even these three things are only the necessary but not sufficient list of things. But I raise them as examples of my simpler, more focused point that I'm going to close on. We must stop thinking of pharmaceutical innovation as a machine. We must stop arguing that there is one or two or three levers you can pull just to get the result you want. We must start thinking about pharmaceutical innovation in complexity terms as a complex adaptive ecosystem. We must tend to that ecosystem in the same way as apothecaries, or more accurately, the apothecaries' wives usually, tended to the garden at the backs of their homes. That is, we must tend to it holistically for the long term and with our shared aim of new drugs at fair prices. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was really clear. We'll go on now briefly to Huseyin. Can I invite you to join us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this. So our remit was to reimagine the pharmaceutical innovation system. And I think if we want to reimagine our system, I think it'd be helpful to understand where we are today and how we got here. So let me start with some data. Our current pharmaceutical innovation system delivers large numbers of new drugs. Each year, somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 new medicines over the last few years, annually. But of course, large numbers of new drugs shouldn't mean we get therapeutically beneficial innovation, the type of innovation that patients and health systems need and want. According to independent evaluations, about more than half of new drugs actually do not offer added therapeutic benefits over existing alternatives, and less than a quarter of new drugs offer major added therapeutic benefits over existing alternatives. And despite all this, companies want to charge higher and higher prices for their products with very little correlation between drug benefits and what companies actually want to charge. So why is that? Well, I would argue that our pharmaceutical innovation system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And in this system, this complex system, as Brian really nicely articulated, I want to focus on the role of regulatory agencies and their evidence standards in shaping the quantity as well as the quality of new drugs that are developed. In other words, I want to talk about the role that regulators play in the pharmaceutical innovation system, the disproportionately important role that they play in this system. Of course, much of our modern pharmaceutical regulation framework dates back to the 1960s, when regulators started requiring evidence from companies that their new drugs actually had some clinical efficacy before they could be marketed. This was after the thalidomide disaster in the late 1950s and 60s, when a drug that was commonly used for morning sickness in early stages of pregnancy was found to cause major birth defects. And this safety disaster was the catalyst for pharmaceutical regulatory reform, first in the US and then in other settings, including the UK. The overarching goal of these reforms in the 60s was to protect public health from hazardous drugs with no proven clinical benefit. In essence, to prevent another thalidomide disaster. We can think of this as the consumer protection role of medicines regulators. And this regulatory objective, broadly speaking, received quite a bit of support from the public as well as policymakers, at least for some time. This, of course, is not to say that regulatory evidence standards that were implemented in the 60s were ever without controversy. Companies, pharmaceutical companies, vehemently opposed these requirements, which of course is understandable. The requirement to demonstrate that new drugs had clinical efficacy before they could be marketed meant that companies had to invest in risky clinical trials before submitting their data to regulatory agencies, which extended the period of research and development, which then ate into the patent protected, or in other words, monopoly period, which is the period during which companies can charge higher prices than what we expected in a competitive market. In the late 1960s and 70s, opposition to these evidence standards from the regulatory agencies started to grow, with louder and louder calls to lower the bar for market entry. And in the 1980s, an important paradigm shift occurred in pharmaceutical regulation, in parallel with or because of major changes in the political landscape. This is the period in the early 80s when regulators started seeing their role differently. They no longer saw their role as protecting public health, but took up a new role in promoting, fostering, and incentivizing pharmaceutical innovation. And what this meant in practice is that regulators developed so-called expedited programs, shortening the duration of clinical development, shortening the duration of regulatory review, and getting products onto the marketplace quicker than before. And in other words, regulators started asking for less evidence before new drugs could be launched, with the hope that such evidence can be generated later on. This was intended to help companies to develop and launch their products quicker and easier than before. In the beginning, regulators intended these expedited programs to prioritize areas with significant unmet need, but over time, these expedited programs became the norm. Approximately 80% of new drugs approved by the US regulators in recent years benefited from at least one such expedited program. And this shift to speed up the development and approval of new drugs means that we now know very little about how well new drugs actually work when they enter the market. As intended, expedited drugs are less likely to have robust studies supporting their approvals. They're more likely to be supported by trials measuring surrogate endpoints. They have trials with smaller sample sizes, shorter follow-up durations, and so on. Therefore, there's substantial uncertainty in the evidence base at the time of regulatory approval. And this uncertainty is really important because patients, clinicians, health technology assessment bodies, payers, and other stakeholders in the system simply don't have the type of robust evidence that's essential to inform their decisions. What's more, it turns out expedited drugs are also more likely to have safety events, safety concerns after regulatory approval compared to non-expedited drugs. Now, you might say, this is not all bad. The increased uncertainty in clinical efficacy and some increase in the risk of harm may be an acceptable trade-off if these expedited drugs offer transformative benefits for patients. But it turns out only about a third of drugs that benefit from these expedited programs actually offer added therapeutic benefits over existing alternatives. So they're not the exceptions or breakthroughs that they're often portrayed to be. So as I conclude, I think the role of regulatory agencies in lowering the bar for market entry has been a dominant trend over the past few decades, and this is an important and predictable driver of where we are today. An innovation system that delivers large numbers of drugs, but doesn't always bring the therapeutic advances that patients and health systems need and want. What this means for me is that when we start thinking about potential solutions to improve the situation and think about reimagining the future of pharmaceutical innovation, strengthening the evidence standards of regulatory agencies must be among the key pillars of reform. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Huseyin. That was great. It's really good to have that summary of drug development and regulations and the importance of evidence. I'd like now to turn to James, if I may, please.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everyone. So we've heard a bit about certain areas for improvement in the incentives for drug development and the role of regulators, and also a brief history of how we got the system that we have. My focus is going to be on payment incentives. And I hope you don't mind, but in this process of reimagining pharmaceutical innovation, I'm going to be the sort of classic academic here and say we should all take a step back for a moment and ask ourselves, if we don't think what we get from the current system is what we want, well, what do we want? And the first question, thinking about this, is, for me, what is the ultimate objective of pharmaceutical policy? And if you look at the literature on this, you'll find a number of responses to this question. And indeed, if you look at policies in this sphere, the underlying reasoning is not always that clear. And to be fair, there's a good reason for that, in the sense that there are probably going to be multiple objectives all being targeted at once. And Brian mentioned a few of them at the beginning. If you think about pharmaceuticals, there's clearly a number of different things going on. The life science industry is a major employer of skilled workers. Making people healthier can improve their productivity and their value to the economy, and so on and so on. But call me reductive, and I'm sure some people will. But I think a very good starting point is to focus on health and think about healthy pharmaceutical policy. That is, pharmaceutical policy that aims to improve the health of the population. Now, there will be a number of relevant stakeholders and participants in the process of drug development, of course, but ultimately, we want to see patients or potential patients benefit from this system that we're putting in place. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on payment policy. And if it is the case that we want to design our system around the patients or potential patients that will ultimately benefit, and we know that paying more for new pharmaceuticals will encourage the development of more new drugs, then why not simply pay as much as we possibly can, if that is the objective? Certainly, this would likely result in more drugs being developed. And indeed, we do see calls from the pharmaceutical industry in particular for the NHS to pay more for new pharmaceuticals in the UK. Well, this is where the economics comes in, because there is only so much money and lots of things we could do with it. We want to make the most out of the scarce resources that are available. Spending more on new pharmaceuticals means necessarily spending less on something else. And of course, there are many determinants of health beyond pharmaceuticals, for example, other forms of healthcare, life-saving healthcare or preventative activities. And indeed, social determinants of health, like education and poverty, for example. So it is quite complicated, really. But one thing is for sure, in my opinion, that when we're spending more from within the NHS budget on new drugs, we're necessarily foregoing other things that the NHS would have done. And these would likely have had some health effects themselves. So recently, the pharmaceutical industry is involved in a report that asks the NHS to pay more for new pharmaceuticals. And the cost to the NHS would be roughly £2.5 billion per year. Now, it is hard to kind of get a sense of how much that actually is. The NHS is just so massive. But just to give a sense, that's probably more than the overall annual budget for primary care in the Yorkshire and Humber region, for example. So it's quite a lot of money. Now, of course, funding that additional expense on pharmaceutical products isn't going to come by cancelling all primary care in Yorkshire and Humber, but there will be activities that have to make way to find that money. And recent research by the University of York has found that for every £10,000 that we spend on something in particular, like a new drug, from within the NHS budget, we'll be giving up a health improvement equivalent to 1 year in good health from the things that the NHS would have done otherwise. So clearly, that's going to be a useful benchmark in thinking about whether we can justify spending money on a new pharmaceutical. And we call this the health opportunity cost. And that's just one part of a larger story. And that moves me on to my final idea about reimagining pharmaceutical innovation. Let's just recap. We want to promote population health, and new drugs clearly play a role in that. The amount we pay for them also has an effect, because we only have a limited amount of money in the NHS. So in our reimagined system of incentives for pharmaceutical innovation, we need to bear all of this in mind. Remember, this is quite reductive, but even so, it's already quite complicated. We need to pay enough to incentivise the development of new drugs, but not too much as to crowd out other NHS activities. So what do we do? How do we ensure we have Goldilocks incentives, not too hot and not too cold? Again, there's some University of York research that looks at this question. And it doesn't say this exactly, but it sort of says that you can think about each new drug as a pie, a highly delicious and nutritious pie. And that pie, the size of that pie, is basically the value that that new drug offers in terms of its potential ability to improve population health. Now, the key thing is that patients want to eat that pie, but the only way it's going to get baked is if the baker keeps a slice of the pie too, or else why would they bake it? So how much of the pie does the baker get to keep? It's a tough question to answer. Back to pharmaceuticals in that context, this is talked about in terms of the share of value that accrues to the manufacturer of a new drug. To answer this question, the researchers drew on a number of different sources, including a related literature that looks at how drug development responds to additional anticipated payment. And this is a question that's received quite a lot of attention in the literature, as you can imagine. Now, clearly, I think what you'd expect is for there to be an effect, and that's what most of the studies find. But some of the best studies in this literature tend to find sort of diminishing marginal returns to this effect, so that for every 1% additional payment, society gets significantly fewer than 1% more drugs developed. Anyway, this input parameter, along with many other parameters, gets fed through an economic model, which determines the optimal sharing of value. The upshot is that the baker should only keep about 20% of the pie. Now, this is emerging research, it's in its initial phases, but I think that this framework is a really useful one to consider and could provide a useful check on whether we have that sort of Goldilocks incentives in place at the moment. Applying it to current arrangements does point to the conclusion that the incentives are perhaps too generous for drug development. And that's the incentives that account for the benefits to patients of new drugs, benefits of future drugs to future patients that our payment will incentivize, and the health opportunity costs resulting from the payment. So that's really my proposal, that we should think about a set of incentives for developers of new drugs that gives developers the right size slice of the pie. Now, I don't think we're quite there yet, but perhaps this is quite a good way of thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. It's really interesting to hear about sort of the use of economic concepts and ideas to frame this. Next, moving to Vicky, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. Thank you also to the other panelists for their thought-provoking statements. They've highlighted some really interesting issues, which I'm looking forward to getting into over the next 40 minutes or so, and also a lot of things that I'm going to touch on in my own sort of opening statement. So my perspective is slightly different to the other speakers, in as much as my background is in policy and specifically ethics, and I'm interested in the ethics of how we go about deciding who gets what from the healthcare budget. So the points that I'd like to make revolve largely around this idea of fairness and what constitutes a fair or reasonableness price. Now, a major problem, in my opinion, with our current approach to pharmaceutical innovation is that we, and by we I mean society, are often just not in a position to make an informed judgment about what a fair return on investment is for the pharmaceutical industry, or what a reasonable price should be for new medicines. So from a practical perspective, that's got to make it difficult for us when negotiating with industry, because as James says, it's hard for us to identify when we're overpaying for a new drug. And approaches like the share of value approach that he mentions, I think, could be really valuable in that respect. But it also makes our health system very vulnerable to acting in ways, either knowingly or unknowingly, that prioritise the needs of industry over the needs of patients. And that's something that's really difficult to defend from a moral perspective, even once we've taken account of the various good things that the life sciences industry does, aside from generating health. So in the time that I've got available, I want to give a little bit of attention to three issues that make it particularly difficult for us to make judgments about what the value of a new medicine is. The first thing I'd highlight is that innovative medicines, almost without exceptions, are really, really, really expensive. So as a quick illustrative comparison, according to the internet, a new fully electric entry-level Tesla is currently in development, which will be available in the UK for about £18,000. Brand new Model 3, which I'm led to believe is a decent model, should set you back about £40,000. Now, most would agree that these are highly innovative, highly desirable products that are the result of many years of investment in science and R&D. Now, in comparison, a year's treatment with Opdivo, a fairly new cancer immunotherapy drug, comes at a list price of around £60,000 per year of treatment. And this is pretty typical for life-extending cancer drugs, some of which are a lot more. Yescarta, a potentially curative treatment for blood cancer and one of the emerging group of personalised therapies, comes at an undiscounted list price of £280,000 per infusion bag. And an infusion bag is around 68 millilitres of product, so around a third of a small teacup, I would estimate. Now, industry justifies these types of prices on the grounds that it costs an awful lot to develop a new medicine. But estimates about exactly how much it costs vary really substantially. Now, most estimates would suggest somewhere between £1 billion and £2 billion. And there's obviously uncertainty about that, but there's also almost inevitably things that can be done. And I think Brian made reference to this, that can reduce that number and to bring that down. But at the moment, because of the way that we incentivise the pharmaceutical industry, they're not particularly incentivised to bring those prices down. And they're also not very incentivised to tell us how much it really costs to develop a new drug. And I think this is particularly interesting in the context of rare diseases, where the argument is that because the market share is so much smaller, the costs are higher. The actual evidence base for some of that, I think, is a little bit unclear. And without understanding what it's actually costing to develop some of these medicines, it's very difficult from an industry perspective to say what a fair return of investment might be. Now, of course, it could be argued that it doesn't actually matter what it costs to develop a new drug. What matters is how much it's worth to those of us who wish to purchase it. But a second issue that health systems have to struggle with is that it's very difficult to establish what new medicines are actually worth. Now, part of that is due to the increasingly thin evidence base for many new drugs, as Husein's talked about, which makes it very difficult for us to have confidence about what we're actually getting for our money. And I don't think that can be emphasised enough. But even when the evidence is good, we often still don't have a good or consistent view of how society actually values different types of health benefit. So, for example, should we be willing to pay more for drugs that treat rare diseases? And if so, why? Should we be willing to pay more for drugs that treat severe diseases? What about drugs that are curative or drugs that treat children? What about drugs that are particularly innovative? There are potentially good reasons for prioritising all these different types of drugs and these different groups of people. But if we can't prioritise everyone, and if we prioritise some people, we need to decide who we're going to deprioritise. If we really do think we need to prioritise everyone and we really do need to be paying that extra 2.5 billion that James referred to, then what should we be deprioritising? Should it be coming from the transport budget, from the education budget, from the defence budget? These are really difficult questions, and we're not all going to agree about how we should answer them. But I would argue that there's an inclination within health systems at the moment to just not really engage with those sorts of questions and just say yes to innovation because it's easier. Now, my third point, and the reason why I think we often find ourselves doing this, relates a lot to what James was just saying. So it's very difficult to say no to a potentially beneficial new drug because it's often very difficult to understand who is going to be paying the opportunity cost for that. So neither the health system nor the public have a good view of where these things are coming from in terms of who's paying for that opportunity cost. So whereas, for example, if we decide not to adopt Yescarta, there are going to be lots of cancer patients and lots of cancer bodies who are very legitimately going to argue that that's against their interests. But we don't know who it is that's being disadvantaged. We don't know what we're losing in order to pay for that third of a teacup of Yescarta. And because we don't know who that other person is, it's very difficult to make sure that their interests are being properly represented. But just because we don't know who those patients are doesn't mean that they don't exist. Now, an argument that I've heard raised by industry in a couple of different forums is effectively that we can just absorb these costs through efficiency, through doing things more efficiently within the NHS. But I think you only have to look at the state of the current NHS, at least in this country, and I think in other health systems, to recognise that that's just not a viable argument. Someone is having to suffer the opportunity cost somewhere, we just don't know who. So ultimately, I think part of the solution to all of this comes down to transparency and the need for us to have a more honest public conversation about the cost of new drugs. So, for example, I think it would be a really big step forward if NICE, the organisation in the UK that makes decisions about which drugs the NHS is going to make available, were to more openly acknowledge the net amount of health that would be gained or lost from the NHS whenever it recommends a new drug. I suspect this would generate some interesting media stories that focus a little bit less on the hype around more new drugs and a little bit more on their cost. And I think that would help to initiate a much wider public and political debate about how the benefits of pharmaceutical innovation are split between different groups in society and between society and industry. I think this debate's really needed. And if we conclude that industry is getting more than its fair share of the benefits, then we need to be brave enough to make the changes necessary to fix that, whether that's increasing the evidential requirements, whether it's putting in place pricing restraints. And unfortunately, I think likely that will sometimes involve having to say no to medicines that just don't justify their price tag. Thank you.
Many thanks, Vicky. Can I invite everyone who are the panelists to join the session and unmute yourself? Thank you. So we've got some great questions online, which I think Huseyin has had the opportunity to answer some of them, but they're so good that it'd be nice to share them as well with everyone. So I first thought actually we'd maybe start with quite a sort of general question about what we mean by innovation and why we think it's a good thing. So I wanted to open that up to the panel, and perhaps if I could start with Vicky, and then if anyone else has any input, if you could put your hand up, please.
Yeah, I think innovation is one of those terms that we're all quite keen to use, but no one's very keen on defining. And I think that's because we see innovative things as valuable for different reasons. So when I think about an innovative drug, I would generally consider it to be innovative if it does something in terms of health benefit that nothing out there currently can do. But that's not what we talk about in terms of innovation often when we're talking about industrial strategy, for example. So a lot of drugs, in fact, almost all new drugs that come to market are discussed as and talked about as innovative. If they don't add significant health benefits, from my perspective, I would not necessarily consider that innovative. Now, whether or not you use a different word to describe that is kind of irrelevant. But I think if we're talking about innovation, we have to be really clear about how we're defining that and why we think it's valuable. And if it's not about health, then I think there's some justification for why the health budget should be paying for innovation.
Thank you, Vicky. I mean, Huseyin, you talked to us about sort of you gave us a summary really historically of, how drug development has happened, the regulation and the evidence required. And I wondered if you've got a sort of perspective on what innovation means as well.
No, I fully agree with Victoria on this one. I think this language around innovation has really permeated the public discourse. When you look at regulatory agencies, they publish these annual reports where they talk about the innovative new medicines that they have approved for use in that particular year, with no distinction whatsoever as to their therapeutic values and therapeutic benefits, and whether they are, exceptional in the benefits that they provide, or if they're incremental or marginal products compared to what we already have on the market. Of course, ideally, we're looking for new medicines to come on the market that address those unmet therapeutic needs, and for new medicines to have added therapeutic benefits above and beyond what we already have on the market. So I think our language should reflect that, and we should not talk about all new medicines approved by regulatory agencies as part of an innovation. So I would very much support Vicky's points on this one.
Thank you very much. And just in the interest of getting to our other questions, I'll move this on. I'm taking the sort of ones with the most upvotes. At the moment, we've got a question, and perhaps I could start with Brian about what suggestions we might have for regulatory reform. Don't know if you've got anything that you might like to add in there, Brian, if you could unmute yourself. Sorry, we can't hear you.
I don't think you can consider regulatory reform on its own. You have to consider regulatory and the exclusivity side of it and patents all together. So it's the hurdles that we have to jump over to get to market. One of the most striking, and I'm going to relate this to the last question as well, one of the most striking things at the moment is that we tend to, the system is set up with some fundamental, what academics would call construct definition errors in it. Okay, so we, for example, put in different differentials with biologics versus small molecules, and actually that's built on the assumption that biologics are more expensive to develop and have greater benefits, and smaller molecules less so. And that's not true. What we ought to be doing is designing the regulatory and exclusivity systems to according to the benefits to deliver in relation to societal needs. Yes, that's one thing. But that relates back to the answer to the first question. If I can just go back to that for a second. Innovation isn't just about, I would broaden the definition of innovation to include anything that creates value. So if I invent a drug which does exactly the same as existing drugs, but does so at half the price, or then it is an innovation. And the system as it is set up at the moment strongly favours innovations which make very small incremental clinical benefits and does not incentivize that latter kind of value creation, the economic value creation, and it should.
Thank you very much, Brian, for extending that definition. That's really valuable. Going back to the upvoted questions, perhaps I could first start to turn to James. There's a question from Matthias Versteger. He says, we know of the health opportunity costs, but we have little insights into the opportunity costs of other investments that is not in health. Is there any insight on total societal return of pharmaceutical R&D? And if it is favourable relative to other investments? Wondered if you could share your insights there.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks, Helen, for giving me a go at it. I'll try my best. It's a big question, isn't it? It's a big picture question, and I think it does align with, I suspect, what I think about this issue, which is that we need to think about health quite broadly and acknowledge that there are many, many determinants of health. Some lie within healthcare and some don't. There are many, many social investments that we can make that are likely to have an effect on health, and these should really all be considered. It does seem to me that there's a disproportionate amount of effort put into evaluating the returns to new pharmaceuticals compared to other forms of expenditure that would improve health. And I think that that's an important issue that needs to be tackled. As regards the evidence around that, it's quite tricky, because when you're talking about something like a social determinant of health, say education, for example, the primary effect you would expect from education would be on something relating to educational outcomes. So it can be quite hard to identify an effect of education on health, but there is a big literature that has found that there is a strong relationship there. I'm not exactly sure of ones that have done a sort of direct head-to-head in terms of where the return is higher, but I think that that's definitely an under-researched question that I'd like to see more people working on.
Thank you very much, James. And thinking, Brian, particularly in your presentation about talking about ecosystems, and thought you might have some insights in response to this question.
Well, two things, of course. I think it's fairly uncontroversial that even if we can't always quantify the benefits, that preventative measures and primary healthcare measures and things get much better bang for bucks than even the best drugs. So I think we did that. The other point to throw in there, and it kind of relates to what Victoria was saying, we can make these suggestions about how much profit should the industry make, but the economists did a really good piece of work on this, comparing the risk-adjusted return on investment of different industries. And pharmaceuticals is not exceptional by any means. So we have to bear in mind that if we reduce the risk-adjusted return on investment of the pharmaceutical industry, it will not get the investment. The investment will go to other industries. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to reduce the cost of pharmaceuticals. It means that if we try to do so without also managing the risk associated with developing pharmaceuticals, which is huge in comparison to other industries, then we'll screw up the ecosystem. So, and to Victoria's point, just to be slightly controversial, it's spurious to compare with, say, Tesla, because if I spend $1 billion on developing a new car, I'm pretty certain to get a car that works. If I spend 2 billion, I'll probably get 2 cars that work. That mathematics doesn't work in pharmaceuticals because of the fundamental lack of understanding of biology that doesn't apply in other sciences.
Wondered if there's any other responses. Huseyin, if I could turn to you.
I was just going to kind of emphasize the importance of maybe something that James also alluded to about payment policy, because what we tend to see with the current environment, the current pharmaceutical innovation landscape or system, is that risk is really high in certain areas, like in oncology, because companies are willing to put up with that risk because they can really generate quite healthy revenues for that. So we clearly have an incentive problem in that sense that we should not only be talking about risk, because companies are able to put up with that risk when they can expect healthy returns for that risk and for that investment. And cancer is a really good example of this, where all sorts of kind of payment policies send the perverse signal to companies that we're willing to pay for really marginal new products and the benefits associated with these new products. And therefore, companies are disproportionately prioritizing cancer therapeutics in their research and development, even though cancer is portrayed to be the riskiest research and development program among all therapeutic areas when we look at the clinical trial progression. So that there's that complication to consider as well, I think is an important one to take into account.
Thank you very much, Huseyin. There's some other questions, so I think we'll just turn to those now. What role can AI tools play, such as ChatGPT or others, to help shaping value of pharmaceutical innovation? And they refer to economic models, but also real-world evidence. And wondered if anyone had some insights to share about your vision on this. I mean, it's amazing what opportunities AI is potentially opening up in terms of, I guess, it potentially post-regulation as well, kind of fifth hurdle, or when drugs are actually in use. But yeah, anything to, if I could come to you, Vicky?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I won't pretend to be an expert in AI. I know there's some very interesting work going on in the role that AI can play in the drug development process. And I think that could be incredibly value if it means that we, increase our hit rate in terms of the new drugs coming through. In terms of valuing drugs, I think there is a role to be played by real world evidence, but I think that role, we have to be very, very careful about that role to make sure that we're not diluting the quality of the evidence. The world is complicated, and randomized controlled trials are not available for everything. It's not possible to always do them, but they do have a place. And I think moving entirely away from that towards a more kind of observational type system has its risks. The other thing I'd say, which is a slightly different point, is in terms of valuing, yes, there are economic models, but assigning a value to something is an inherently normative task. It is about how we value things, what we think is good in the world, what we want to achieve. So I think there is always going to be a role for people in that process. And in particular, there's always going to be a role for deliberation, because we are not going to agree on what is valuable and how valuable things are. So I'm really reticent about moving towards a kind of algorithmic approach to calculating the value of certain drugs. I think James's share of value approach is really interesting, and I think it's a great starting point for deliberation, but I think it's probably the start point, not the end point. And I think that people and arguments and reasoning should always be a part of that process.
Helpful. Thank you very much, Vicky. Just in the interest of time, I'll probably just move us on to a couple more questions before we end the session. So Benny Becker asks, how does the pie model reflect research and development risk? To stay in the picture, the baker bakes a few pies which do not work out. So how shall this be considered? I guess we've been talking a bit about risk, but if you'd like to, perhaps if I could turn to you, James, first.
Well, I'm so glad that the pie model is being talked about. I have to say that's not actually my analogy originally, but one of my colleagues. So I can't take full credit. I'm also glad that this is a post-lunch session, or else the pie model might have been a risky one, might have lost a few participants. In terms of reflecting R&D risk, to be honest, at the moment, as I kind of mentioned, this is a relatively new way of thinking about this, where we think about the value of a new drug and sharing that between health systems and manufacturers, if you like. And so at this point in time, there's not been a huge amount of focus on the risk. I would say it's, to some extent, it's kind of in there in a little bit, because I mentioned how one of the parameters was that relationship between anticipated payment and new drugs being developed. Obviously, as we've been talking about just now, risk is a huge part of what expected profits might be for a new drug, and industry is likely to be risk averse when thinking about what they expect from a new drug that they're developing. So it's kind of baked in there to some extent, but at the moment we haven't done the work to kind of pull that out and analyze it in much more detail, but it's something that we're looking to do.
Very much, James. Before I move us on to the next question, would anyone else like to add into that? Okay. Somebody is asking about lower and middle income countries and how to go about these complex and highly technical processes for countries where they don't have sufficient financial and human resources to pay for value in pharmaceutical markets. I see you nodding, Huseyin. Would you mind if I turn to you for your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Helen. I think this is such an important question because unfortunately we have new products that are being developed for high-income countries with the expectations and the markets and expected profits associated with high-income countries, and in particular the United States, which accounts for almost half of the pharmaceutical market, and then all other countries being on the receiving end of that innovation, of that development and those product launches. And of course, increasingly we see that regulatory agencies as well as health and technology assessment bodies that are looking at the value of these products are kind of deferring to other countries that have already appraised those products. And therefore, there's a bit of a diffusion of decision-making. That as we're lowering the evidence standard for these products to come on the market, we're seeing that other countries are increasingly adopting similar types of standards, which of course is unfortunate, but almost inevitable given the fact that as the person who's asked the question has raised, the resources are not always available, the technical expertise may not be available, and it's inevitably a time-consuming process to evaluate the benefits and harms of new products, as well as their costs, of course. So again, one thing that we should be considering is to raise the evidence standards of these big global regulatory agencies like the FDA, the European Medicines Agency, and the MHRA, and others that play a disproportionately important role in this landscape.
Thank you very much, Huseyin. Yeah, that's so interesting, and there's so much more to be done. I think we're coming quite near to the end now, but I would like to ask a couple more questions if we can fit them in. Somebody has asked about ideas, and I'd like to try and ask everyone really about that we might have to incentivize manufacturers to develop drugs that cost the system less. And I wondered if anyone had sort of ideas about this. I haven't got anyone particular that I wanted to start with. But I think it's really important, isn't it, to think about how farmers incentivized to help us and to enable us to get some sort of fair share of value. If I could perhaps first turn to Vicky. Thank you.
It might be a slightly facile point, but all the time we keep on paying the prices that they're demanding, they're not going to be incentivized to demand less. So a really simple thing to do would be to occasionally say no if we think they haven't done enough to demonstrate value, be that because of uncertainty or just because of the small therapeutic benefits things seem to be sometimes offering.
That's a fair point to my mind, Vicky, thank you. James, I think you quickly had your hand up, and also if I could then turn to Brian afterwards.
Well, I think I was possibly going to say what Brian's about to say, so let's hand over to Brian, because it was actually just quoting something he said earlier. So I'll hand over to Brian.
So thanks, James. So it relates to that point about the definition of innovation and value, and that we bend the system all sorts of ways and shapes to incentivize drugs for particular diseases or particular cases and certain types of drugs. If we designed the system so it encouraged the incentives were for drugs which saved money, either in a way that in their efficacy or in their cost, then that would change the nature of the system. It comes back to aligning the incentives to what we're trying to achieve rather than what we want to make. Let me just make one final contentious point there. Because I'm an evolutionary scientist, I study the evolution, the Darwinian evolution of the industry. The question is not, the interesting question for me is, why is the industry the way it is now? Okay? And at least part of the reason that the incentives are set up now is that, remember, the whole industry is driven by the US market. The US market dominates everything. And in the US market, the oil and gas industry is a huge spender on lobbying. It is the second biggest. It spends the second biggest amount on lobbying. Do you want to guess what the first biggest industry for lobbying expenditure is? I think you know. Yeah. It's the pharmaceutical industry. And that's why we have the laws we have and the system we have in the States, or part of the reason at least, and that distorts the world market.
Thank you. Whilst we ponder that, and it's a very important point, I wanted to thank our administrators who've just put up the closing poll online. So whilst we perhaps attempt to answer one last question, if you could, those who are participating, have a go at answering those two questions we asked you earlier as well, to see if there's been any change in your views. So while people just have one last think about that, I suppose I'd like to ask everyone, just go through everyone in turn, perhaps starting with Huseyin. Really, if you could identify one sort of key area for pharmaceutical innovation that you'd like to see some change in, could you share that with us?
I'm going to cheat and suggest two things, one simpler than the other. The simple one would be to improve the labeling of products so that we better communicate the evidence base that supports the approval of new medications, so that people are actually aware of the data that supports approvals. And the second one is actually to raise the bar, meaning asking for more robust evidence for new drug approvals.
Very clear. Thank you very much. If I could come to Vicky next.
Yeah, my one's all about transparency and trying to change the public discourse. I think we need to be much more open and be willing to admit the trade-offs that we're making and the fact that there are losers as well as winners. And I think that's not just a question for the UK, but it's a question for the whole kind of global market, in particular the US.
I really like that brave approach. Thank you, Vicky. Turning to Brian.
Throw money at translational science. If instead of 1 in 10,000 drugs reaching market, it was 1 in 1,000, it would completely change the economic dynamics of the industry.
Thank you. And finally, James.
Yeah, I mean, I have to really just echo what Vicky said on this, I would say. We need to be very transparent about what we're valuing in terms of pharmaceuticals and draw on the best evidence that we can in order to do that.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. It's been such an interesting session, and for sharing so clearly and honestly your ideas on this. There's some great talking points, so many questions actually. We've only begun answering about a third of them, so I'm very grateful also to the participants who shared their ideas and obviously are very sort of engaged and enthused with the session. I can now go back to the results of our poll. So on the question 2 about financial incentives, because that's come through first, about 14 people were saying that that was too generous. So it's quite sort of heavily weighted towards being too generous, whereas before it was perhaps more evenly distributed across the area, the 4 answers that potentially we could answer. In terms of incentives facing developers, still it seems that we need to keep thinking about how we can fix this. So on that note, I just want to say thank you once again to all the speakers for being very generous to share your time and expertise. It's been a great and really informative session. And I look forward to reading more about the articles that you've written on this, because I know you've all done quite a lot of research in the area, and for those who are interested in more details. So thank you one and all. Thank you very much. Goodbye.